TV. 48 hours of programs about nonfiction books, authors, and the publishing industry. Every weekend here on C-SPAN 2. This bestseller by Howard Zinn offers a historical look at the U.S. through the stories of people not usually covered in traditional histories. Next, Mr. Zinn discusses his approach and his views on how lessons from the past make a difference to the future. He spoke at the San Francisco Bay Area Book Festival, and he's introduced by board director Cheryl Fullerton.
Okay, it is my great pleasure to introduce Howard Zinn, a respected professor, historian, and author of the landmark A People's History of the United States, 1492 to the present. He has taught at Boston University and Spelman College. Would you all please join me in welcoming Howard Zinn?
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. I'm putting my watch down to pretend that I care. I don't know how much you know about my book or what's in the book. Maybe you know everything that I have to say to you. But I will talk about my book because I don't know what else to talk about. I'll tell you how I came to write it and why I came to write it in this funny way. And I wrote the book in the sort of late 1970s, I guess when I had some breathing space after the anti-war movement. During the anti-war movement, we were all doing all these furious things. There was, many of you know this. The war was the center of our lives, and we were running around the country and doing this and that, and there was no time, certainly no time to write a 700-page book. So I was putting out little things, a 125-page book called Vietnam, The Logic of Withdrawal, and a 100-page book called Disobedience and Democracy. No more time. But now I had time, so I decided to write what people had been looking for, or at least people would approach me and say, you've been teaching American history and so on. Can you recommend a good one-volume history of the United States from a radical point of view? No. Well, not really. I don't want to go into bibliographical detail about what there is and what there isn't, but not exactly, But these were the demands that came out of the movements of the 60s, because out of the movements of the 60s, people were looking for something different. People were remembering the kind of history they had learned in high school and college and was thinking, this doesn't fit what I see in the world today. And so they were looking for something, and so I decided to write something to fill that need. Now, clearly, those of you who know the book I know that I came to that history from a very definite point of view. And I guess this was because when I began to study history, when I decided that's what I would do, I would write history and I would teach history, I already knew that I was not going to be a neutral teacher. I was not going to be a neutral historian. I have a memoir called, you notice how I'm advertising all my books? Isn't this a book festival? Yeah, I have many more. You'll hear many more things like that. And I'll just try not to mention other people's books. But I wrote a memoir called You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train. And then the idea of it came from things I would say to my classes at the beginning of the class. I would say, now look, this is not going to be a neutral class. This is not going to be one of those classes where you spend a semester or a year with a teacher, and at the end of the semester, at the end of the year, you have no idea where this teacher stands on the important issues of the day. We've all had teachers like that, right? There are a lot of them. No, I wasn't going to be neutral. I had a point of view, a strong point of view, and I wasn't going to hold back on it because I didn't believe you might say had a very modest desire in going into history. I just wanted to change the world. And I figured you can't change the world if you're neutral. And besides, to be neutral, no. Well, the world is already moving in certain directions. There's no real thing, neutrality. It doesn't exist. The world is already moving in certain directions. Wars are going on. Children are going hungry. Terrible things are being done. To be neutral in such a world is to collaborate with what is going on. And so, no, I wasn't going to be neutral as a historian. And yes, I kind of knew as I started to write this book what my point of view was going to be. And it came out of my background. It came out of my life experience. It came out of the fact that at the age of 18, I didn't go to college. I went to work in a shipyard. Stayed in the shipyard for 3 years. I didn't do it as a sociological experiment. Let's go interview the shipyard workers and do an oral history of shipyard workers. Yeah, no, that wasn't it. I just came from that kind of background, that kind of family, that kind of neighborhood, and working class parents and so on, struggling, no thought of going to college when you got 18. Everybody around me went to work at the age of 18. So I worked in a shipyard for 3 years and helped organize the young shipyard workers who were excluded from the AFL unions. Black people were excluded from the unions. Women were excluded from the unions. Unskilled workers were and so we formed a kind of industrial union, an IWW, almost. That's what we like to think, Whenever we do something good, we like to compare ourselves to the IWW, you see. And we were, you might say I grew up class conscious. With a phrase you don't hear much in the United States, that is, we're not supposed to have classes in the United States. We're all one big happy family, you see. All of our interests are the same, Exxon and me, the founding fathers and all of us, the very, name Founding Fathers, we're related by blood to those slave owners who sat in on the making of the Constitution. Yeah, no, we're not one big family, despite the attempts on the part of the establishment to draw us all in to this net and say our interests are one. You hear them talking about, is this in our national interest? Is this in the interest of national security? Actually, it may be in the interest of somebody's securities, but not in the interest of national security, you see. But all these phrases are supposed to envelop us all in one common bond of interest, and thus hiding the fact that we are a society of many different interests, of people who are rich and people who are poor, and a lot of people in between who are nervous. And so we, black and white and men and women and immigrants, no, it's a society of people in stressful relationship with one another. And so I wanted to write a history which would be from a class-conscious point of view. I wasn't going to write about the Founding Fathers and the making of the Constitution and glorify the Constitution, which was written by 55 rich white men in Philadelphia. I wasn't going to do that, even though, I was taken aback for a moment when, Ronald Reagan, during the bicentennial year of the Constitution, 1987, Ronald Reagan wrote an essay. Can you believe that? Ronald Reagan wrote an essay for some scholarly magazine, Parade magazine, in which he talked about the Constitution and said, the Constitution could only have been created with the guiding hand of God. Well, I thought this was really an insult to God. When you consider, the Constitution was written to perpetuate the wealth, to perpetuate slavery, to perpetuate things as they were, to replace the British ruling class with a local ruling class. That's what the Constitution was written for. I'm sorry to be so harsh on the Founding Fathers. They're nice guys. They look good. They dress well. You know, they're very eloquent. But no, I was going to write about history I didn't want to write about American industrial progress as it was presented to me in high school. It was presented to me in high school. I remember sitting there in class, and this is the period of the great American Industrial Revolution, when America became a great economic power. You know, that period between the Civil War and World War I, when you know, and I remember sitting there transfixed as the figures were put up on the board of how many more steel ingots were being produced each year. You know, how many miles of railroad track and a transcontinental railroad. Wow, how romantic and how beautiful. And we were so proud. Nothing was said in those classes, and nothing was said in my textbooks about who worked on those railroads, about the Irish immigrants and the Chinese immigrants who worked on those railroads and died in great numbers in the sickness and the heat in those railroads. I wasn't going to tell about the great industrial miracle of the United States, that leaving out the girls who went to work in the textile mills of New England at the age of 12 and died at the age of 25. You know. And I wasn't going to look at the state of the country from the standpoint of the Dow Jones average. You know, I mean, if you look historically, you know, and I was sort of prepared for this by some of my work in history. I was prepared looking back at eras which had been triumphantly proclaimed as wonderful eras. You know, remember the era of goodwill? Do they still have that in the textbooks? But they certainly have, you know, the Roaring '20s, the Jazz Age, the Age of Prosperity. I mean, history is very simple. The '20s were prosperous. Everybody was prosperous in the '20s, and everybody was depressed in the '30s. So, but I was doing a study of Fiorello LaGuardia, my first book. Mention another book, yes. Never miss an opportunity. First, my doctoral dissertation actually was on Fiorello LaGuardia. And a lot of you know who Fiorello LaGuardia is? Some people, yes, I mean, some people, you know, think, you know, he's an airport, you know. But he was, you know, a lot of people know he was mayor of New York, very colorful character. But before that, a lot of people don't know this, and I didn't know this until I started working with him, he was a congressman in the 1920s, representing East Harlem, representing a poor district of East Harlem. An interesting congressman, the most radical member of Congress. He was a Republican and a socialist. Don't ask me to explain that, you see. But I was reading the letters that LaGuardia's constituents were writing to him from East Harlem in the 1920s in the Age of Prosperity. The Jazz Age, and these letters from his constituents were saying, help me, you know. My husband is out of work. My kids don't have enough to eat. They've turned off the gas, you know. And it was true all over the country, but nobody noticed it because the headlines were about the Wall Street and the stock market and how well it was doing. And you, I mean, you learn about today when you read about history. If you don't learn about today, if you don't learn about today when you're learning about history, then there's not much point, you know, except fun. Oh yeah, you can have fun. But I never wanted to be a historian who went into the past and got lost. You know, the past is interesting. You go in and you read those letters and the documents, and it's detective work and it's fun, you know, but you can get lost there. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to see what I could find and come out and apply it to what was going on in the world. I left the shipyard to enlist in the Air Force. And you can tell I'm a kind of military person. But there was a war on. No, not the Spanish-American War. No, it was World War II, the war against fascism, and I was imbued. There's a lot of young radicals were imbued. Young everybody, you know, yes, the war against fascism. Let's, you know, and so I became a bombardier in the Air Force and flew bombing and dropped bombs and in the, where bombs are dropped, meaning not where they're intended to go. Sometimes where they are intended to go, which sometimes is worse. But in any case, I became a bombardier, but I came out of this. This is the good war, as you know, right? This is the best of wars. I wrote a book. I wrote a book once called Post-War America, and I had a chapter in it about World War II. And the chapter was called The Best of Wars. And Studs Terkel, you know, wrote The Good War later. But a wonderful book. If you notice, if you look at the book closely, the phrase "the good war" in Studs Terkel's book is surrounded by quotation marks. Yeah, because it's not that simple, it's not that clear, it's not that unambiguous, it's very complicated. And I came out of that good war, in which I had been an eager bombardier, came out of the war convinced that war solves nothing. The war doesn't solve fundamental human problems. And even when it seems to do so, even when it starts off looking that way, even when the enemy is vicious and you, because the enemy is vicious, you look good. This is a common mistake. The mistake is that if the enemy is evil, you must be good. Well, I came out of the war persuaded that war, yeah, well, it didn't take long. There were those promises made in World War II. Those promises, you know, this would be, we're going to defeat fascism and we're going to have a wonderful new world, you know, right? We're going to have a world, you know, we're not going to have racism anymore because we're going to defeat Hitler. Hitler represents racism. We're not going to have war anymore. We're not going to have militarism anymore. No. We're going to have the UN. We're going to have, yeah. Well, it doesn't take much observation of the years that follow World War II to begin to ask the question, if 50 million people died in World War II, what did they die for? For this kind of world with a perpetuation of war and militarism and racism, and yes, and fascism and nooks and crannies all over the world, including our own country. Fascism is not confined to national boundaries. Fascism exists in every prison in this country, really. You know, and there exists in the military. There, you know, yeah. So, anyway, the point is that from this point on, if I was going to deal in history with war, and writing history and teaching history, I had a very strong point of view, and the point of view was anti-war. And my personal experience, like dropping napalm on a little village in France toward the end of the war and killing German, Frenchmen, whoever happened to be there, basically to test out napalm. That's the only reason I could figure out for doing it. It was the first use of napalm. You know, and then watching the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and then reading John Hersey and having the stories of the people, children caught in that. No, I wasn't going to be neutral on the question of war. And I wasn't going to look at war from the standpoint of the statesmen and the decision makers, the generals. I was going to look at war from the standpoint of the GIs and the soldiers and the young men cajoled and coerced into going to war. I also wanted to look at war from the standpoint of the other side. Yeah, and this is something you don't think about. Let's look at war from the standpoint of the enemy, the other people, right? Let's look at the Mexican war from the standpoint of the Mexicans. Well, when you look at the Mexican war from the standpoint of the Mexicans, well, here we are. We're in Mexican territory. I mean, right? This was part of Mexico, and we stole it. I mean, there's no other word for it. We provoked a war with Mexico so that we could take half of Mexico. Some people thought we were being moderate. We should have taken all of Mexico. But no, we took... No, I wanted to tell a story of Mexico, of that war, yeah, from the standpoint of the GIs who woke up one day, American immigrant kids who just for the same reason that most young people join wars, join out of desperation and need and desire to get ahead or whatever, and then find themselves in a bloody mess which they don't want any part of. And so they began deserting from the American army in the Mexican War. From their point of view and from the point of view of the Mexicans. And so, it was my experience, and it was history also. When I looked at the history of wars, and the history of America's wars, I know there are good wars and bad wars. Good wars and bad, we have these lists, right? Good wars and bad wars. I had a student once who wrote, they treat wars like wines. This is a good year, this is a bad year. He said, but war is not like wine. War is like cyanide. One drop and you're dead. And all the experience of in all the other wars since the war to end all wars, since World War II, sort of confirmed what I felt about war, and of course right up to this very day. And I wanted to, one of the things I wanted to get across to students is to lose their subservience to power, lose their subservience to authority, lose their subservience to the so-called experts. There was no more vivid lesson during the Vietnam War than lesson about experts. And I remember people at the beginning of the anti-war movement saying, well, now wait a while, these people in Washington, why do you think they're there? They know what they're doing. Really? Really? Just look at the history of what people in Washington have done and ask, they know what they're doing? They can be Phi Beta Kappa, and they were in the Kennedy and Johnson administration. They were the best and the brightest. They were the smart, right? And they engaged in the most stupid and most immoral set of actions that we've had in the history of our country for a long time. So I wanted my students to learn to think for themselves and to learn and seek out information for themselves, not to depend, on what the president says, what the media say, or what the textbooks said, not even what my book said, but to look things up for themselves and make up their own minds. So, and then after I'm continuing my little autobiographical romp, you see, year by year, it will only take a few hours, and So I went to college under the GI Bill. I love it when people say we mustn't have big government. We mustn't have government do things for people, right? Government is doing too much for mothers taking care of kids who are collecting $350 a month. Really, the government's not good. It creates dependency. Oh, really? When we give billions of dollars to the corporations, does that create dependency? No. No. Big government. And it was different during the New Deal when people began to realize government, although government has mostly been on the side of the rich and powerful, it is possible sometimes for government to do something for the poor, as it did in the 1930s when it passed Social Security, of course under the impetus of social movements, under the impetus of the labor movement, and so on, under the impetus of strikes all over the country and tenant strikes and so on. But good things were done by government in that time. And people have forgotten about that, and some people deliberately want to forget about that, and they say, big government is no good. But the GI Bill was big government. It was the government giving 4 years of free education to everybody who served in World War II. And so I went through my entire educational thing right up through the PhD, never paid $1 in tuition. I know the young people looking at me rather enviously at this point. Yeah, so I studied history at NYU, Columbia. My first teaching job, Spelman College, Atlanta, Georgia, black women's college. And did Marion arrive yet? No, she may never arrive. No, she'll arrive. Yes, she'll arrive. 7 years at Spelman College. My wife and kids got into our old Chevy and went down to Atlanta and spent the next 7 years, 1956 to 63, very special time to be in the South and to be living in the black community and to see the tremors under the surface begin to develop, and then see things burst out in 1960, with the sit-ins, in 61 with the Freedom Rides, and 62 and 63 in Albany, Georgia, and Birmingham, and the mass demonstrations, and the thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people being involved. An amazing, amazing episode in our history, out of which I learned an enormous amount. I certainly learned more from my years at Spelman than my students learned from me. I learned a lot about politics. I learned about education. I learned a lot about democracy. I learned about, well, one thing I learned about education, the business of, you see history from a different point of view. When you look at history from a black point of view, it looks different. You look at history from a women's point of view, it looks different. From a Native American point of view. From Native American point of view, take the Revolutionary War. As we know, that was a good war. Right? How can you beat the Revolutionary War? There are the statues all over. Here I come from Boston. Boston would die if not for the Revolutionary War and the statues that it can have in its public square. But Boston needs all of that. And the Revolutionary War, yes, it freed us from England. From the point of view of the Indians, it was a disaster. The British had set a line beyond which the colonists could move west into Indian territory. Proclamation of 1763. We win the war against England, we abolish the line, and then we move into Indian territory and all across the country. And then follows 100 years of massacres, right? Another sort of very neglected set of episodes in American history. All I learned about was Sitting Bull and Custer's Last Stand. But from history from a black point of view looks certainly different. The heroes look different. All the traditional heroes look different. The eras and their names look different. Everybody learns about the progressive. Everybody who takes American history learns about the progressive era in American history. Right? They must still have that in the books. Always the progressive era, the first 20 years of the 20th century, when it's called the progressive era because various reforms were passed. The railroad regulation and the Meat Inspection Act. Notice how good our meat is as a result of that, and the Federal Reserve System, the Federal Trade Commission, the direct election of senators, etc. Graduated income tax. You notice how graduated our income tax is these days? Yeah. Well, anyway, but reform. So it's the progressive era. Those were exactly the years in that progressive era when more black people were lynched in this country than in any other period of American history. So, I began to read the black historians who were not on my reading lists in Columbia. Really, they were not. And then, of course, I learned, well, just by becoming involved in the movement, just becoming involved in that movement that my students initiated. They always think that faculty, whenever students are involved, you notice that during the Vietnam War, they think some faculty person must have instigated. It's never that way. The students start it, the faculty people come in, some. But you learn learned a lot about education. Learned that education is not simply what you get in a classroom, it's what you learn out in the midst of a social struggle. I remember when my students, when Marion and a whole bunch of other students of Spelman and Morehouse, etc., were getting arrested in downtown Atlanta for sitting in, one of my colleagues, a political scientist, PhD from Johns Hopkins, I want to give him his full due before I wrote a letter to the Atlanta Constitution deploring that his students were missing class and going downtown to participate in these demonstrations. Their education, they're losing out on their education. Well, obviously, this man was losing out on his education. He didn't understand what education was and didn't understand that people learn more in the heat of social struggle than they can simply by books in classrooms. Sure, books in classrooms are good, and you come back from the picket line and come back to the classroom and you want to read more, learn more. You want to read more history of what it is you were involved with. So, yeah, I learned a lot. I learned from my students. I learned never to mistake silence for agreement. You know, no, because you looked at the surface. You came to Spelman College in 1956. Things look quiet. Everybody's well behaved. People are going, you know, they're doing their lessons. They're going to do the right things to become successful, do what their parents want them to do, and become, you know, people of some substance and use in the black segregated community, right? Well, that's the way it looked. And you could, looking at that surface of quiet and silence, you would say, as so many people say about students today or about people today, where are they? They're not doing anything, you know. Never look at the surface of things. This is what I learned. And always assume that if something is wrong, under the surface, there's a kind of common sense understanding that something is wrong. I believe in this country there's a common sense understanding that there's something wrong with spending $270 billion on weaponry when 40 million people are without health insurance and health, you know, other, you know, there's kind of, people understand that, you know, and people fundamentally understand things, you know, and but very often they're quiet about it. They're practical. They're waiting for the right moment. They're waiting for somebody to make the first move, and so, you know, at a certain point, my students at Spelman burst out, you know, of that silence, and they and young people and older people all over the South, black people, all over the South, just galvanized the country and the world and embarrassed the U.S. government into finally doing something. One of the things we learned at that time, you don't depend on the government. Don't depend on even the most liberal government. I mean, we had liberal governments and conservative governments. We had Democrats and Republicans for 100 years in this country after the passage of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was supposed to guarantee racial equality, and it didn't matter who was in power in Washington. They didn't do a thing to enforce the 14th Amendment until black people in the 1950s and 1960s came out en masse and embarrassed the government of the United States into doing something. And that was when democracy came alive. Democracy is not a set of procedures. It's not a framework. Democracy is people giving you something to drink when you're thirsty. You know. So, yeah, democracy came alive in the 60s. No, democracy, as I said, is not, you know, it's not what we learned in junior high school. This is democracy. I'm going to put it on the blackboard. Here are the three branches of government: executive, legislative, judicial. Here's the Constitution. That's democracy. A vote every 4 years. That's democracy. No. If we depended on that, we would be lost more than we are. The thing that changed things, to the extent that they did change for black people, for working people in this country, for women, for disabled people, for people against war. The government of the United States did not initiate any of the things that were necessary to remedy those grievances. People had to go out and create movements in order to bring that about. And then, if the movement became strong enough and loud enough and persistent enough, then the government responded. So that was the lesson of democracy. What else should I say? What other books of mine haven't I mentioned?
I hear there's a documentary being made about people's history.
What's that?
I hear there's a documentary being made about people's history.
Well, maybe. Maybe. It's possible. But how about questions? How about questions? Yes, I'm finished. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
There's a microphone set up back there. There's a microphone set up right back there in case people can't project.
Oh. Is it bad if people speak from their seats? Yeah? Does C-SPAN not like that? Who do you think we're doing this for? Mike, what? You want people to line up behind the mic?
Yeah.
Well, can people speak from their seats? Is that all right? And then I repeat the question and distort it, as I usually do. Okay. Yes. Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
I have a question. I'm curious about Gallaudet University. In 1988, the big revolt was called Deaf President Now, and deaf people really mobilized. And then they closed the university. It was at that time called the college. They closed it for a week to do the Deaf President Now revolt. So I'm wondering, that had a large impact on American history, at least deaf people think so. But I was looking in the section about history during that period of time, and there was no mention at all of Deaf President Now.
Yeah.
So it hasn't really impacted American history according to the books.
My book, or books generally? Well,
General history
generally,
books. General history
including
books.
my book. Yeah, really. I'm ashamed to say this,
No,
but
no.
from time to time, people have pointed out
So I
to me
want to
things
know
I've
your
missed
opinion.
in my book. You know, I've missed a lot. Yeah, and you know, when the first edition of the book came out, I really didn't do justice to the struggles of Chicano people in this country. Didn't do justice to the struggles of gay and lesbian people in this country. Didn't do justice to the struggles of disabled people, or, you know, to this event, which was I remember that event, and to me it was such a perfect example of democracy coming alive, where, you know, the students protest in this remarkable way. To have a president who represents their own situation. Yeah, and that was a wonderful event. And I'm going to make note of it for the next time there's another printing of my book. And the printings come fast. So I'll make a note of that. I wish you'd send me some stuff, okay? Do you do email? Do you do email? No, I'm not a card person. No, I'm not.
Yes, I have email.
Yeah, email.
But I don't know your email address.
I'll tell you my email address. It's, God, everybody's listening. Don't listen. Hzinn at bu.edu. Got it? Hzinn at bu. Be it like a boy. .edu. Yes.
Many of us thought that the World War II was just another imperialist war being fought between two powers trying to capture territory. But then after World War II, seeing what Hitler had done, seeing what the role of Hitler had been, some of us began to think about that war as maybe it had been necessary to fight in it. I just wondered whether you had changed any in your estimation.
Do you want me to repeat? Do I have to repeat that? Oh, yeah. Asking me the most difficult question that I get that question a lot, and it is, if I could know in advance that a person would ask that question, I wouldn't recognize them. Because this, but there it is, it's out. She was asking me about World War II and saying that she started off with the notion it's an imperialist war, imperialists on both sides, but then when with the stories of the death camps, when the Holocaust and all of that, she changed her mind about the war. Well, it's the reason I say it's a tough question, because it's very, very complex, and let me say this, something had to be done about fascism, right? Something had to be done about Hitler. The only question is whether it had to be done in the way that it was done, and whether it didn't come late, late, because the main concern of the nations fighting the war was not the Jews and not racism and not militarism. It wasn't their concern, but it's true that even, there are unintended consequences of bad intentions, right? And so the thing I would come away from, I'd say World War II is complex. We did not have to kill huge numbers of civilians in German cities, and we didn't have to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I didn't have to drop napalm on this little town in France. So something had to be done about fascism, and the question that's left is, was there any way to fight against fascism without, at some point in the war, beginning to duplicate the atrocities of the other side? That's a big question, and it's a very unanswerable question, because it's all gone. I'll just say one more thing. The problem with World War II having such elements of goodness and questioning about it, the problem with it is the ambiguity of World War II. The problem with that is that to the extent that World War II can be seen as a good war, it cast a soft glow on every war that has followed since, wars which don't have that ambiguity, wars which are crass imperial wars. But World War II is used as a metaphor, and it's used to justify Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Kosovo. They pull it out every time, to help them justify unjustifiable killing. So World War II is past. The real question is, how do we react to the wars today, and how do we react to the wasting our enormous national treasures on preparation for war? Yes.
I wanted to ask about your involvement with the End the Sanctions Against Iraq campaign.
My involvement with what?
The End the Sanctions Against Iraq campaign.
Oh, my involvement with the Sanctions Against Iraq campaign. You all know about the sanctions against Iraq. You all know that we've been carrying on ever since the Gulf War. It's interesting how many Americans don't know about it. If you took a poll in the United States and asked, you would find most Americans do not know that we've been carrying on a campaign of sanctions which have killed hundreds and hundreds of thousands of children in Iraq. Which leads me to a parenthetical remark. No, I'll hold that. Let me know when Marion arrives. Somebody, like we have a spotter. I haven't been involved in it except talking about it, and telling about it. I haven't been one of those heroic people who, in the voices of the wilderness, those people who are breaking the law, the American law, and bringing food and medicine to Iraq, and they've done it, 15, 16 times. And one of the most shameful episodes in recent American history, carried on by, the liberal Clinton administration, really, and justified by it in the most awful ways. And there's an enormous disproportion of attention to atrocities depending on what the people in power want us to pay attention to. And all atrocities should be paid attention to. But the fact is, if thousands of people are killed in Kosovo, that is brought to our attention, and it should be brought to our attention. Although the thousands of people we then kill in bombing in order presumably to do something about it, that's not brought to our attention. And the hundreds of thousands of people who die as a result of our sanctions, that's not brought to our attention. We have a real problem in getting past what the media tells us is important and deciding for ourselves on the basis of searching out independent sources of information, deciding for ourselves what really is important. I don't know what else I can say about it. I have a feeling that, you know, sometimes behind questions, you know there's an answer, right? That is, the people who ask the questions, they know the answer they want, right? And I feel there's an answer you wanted which you didn't get. Am I right?
No, I saw your name in the newspaper with many other scholars, and I just wondered how you got involved with the issue.
Oh, you wonder how I got involved?
Yeah.
That's easy. Getting involved is easy. You know, people get to know after a while who would get involved in such a thing, you see? And, you know, and if I can, you know, be on, you know, the list of American airlines or whatever, I can certainly be on the Stop Sanctions Against Iraq list. Yes. Oh, there's a man way back there who's held his hand up for a long time.
Why is it so extraordinarily difficult for either the government and or private enterprise to provide at least sufficient shelters for the homeless, particularly in our urban centers? Because I recall some time ago a man who wanted to open up, I think, a deserted post office warehouse right next to the White House, and he had to fast. And he finally got on TV, and somehow the federal government opened up that warehouse for temporary shelter. I mean, again, along with your point about 444 million people not insured in our country with health insurance, it's very shameful that we cannot provide at least shelter for the homeless. Is it not? I mean, well, that's obvious.
Is it not shameful? Yes. That's an easy one, right?
Is it because the politicians...
Homeless people don't vote, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of, you know, and therefore and very often, you know, people who are the most aggrieved, most harassed, have the least resources to fight back, and therefore they depend on the rest of us to speak up for them, like prisoners in jail who are not in a position to fight back, you know, and and they need people on the outside to advocate for them. And the same thing is true of the homeless. It's, you know, instead of asking, oh, sure, we should ask, why isn't the government doing this? And we should ask, you know, why aren't the people who have homes speaking up in loud voices for the homeless? You know. Who's had a hand up for a long time? Go ahead. Yes.
I'm curious about individual acts of violence as part of revolution, and what you think, is there a separation? Is there a time at which individual acts of violence are effective and a good idea as opposed to war?
She asks, maybe you got, did you all get that? No. She asks about, I'm obviously speaking against the violence of war, and she asked me, what about the violence of individuals? I assume you mean the violence of individuals, presumably for some good purpose, right? Well, it always looks, violence is very tempting because it very often seems to offer a quick solution for a problem that you face, but it's poisonous. It has consequences which simply spread the idea of violence and which reinforce the acts of violence that are carried on a large scale. In fact, the two things reverberate. The government's acts of violence, I believe, encourage those individual acts of violence, which then are deplored. Oh, how horrible that they blow up the building in Oklahoma City, or they do this, and that's looked upon with horror by the same people who were ready to kill thousands of people and have, in bombing campaigns. There's a connection between the two. There's a connection between violence in the schools and violence in the streets and violence that comes out of Washington. And we ought to, think about that kind of hypocrisy. But I don't believe that violence is a solution. I think the poet June Jordan, who lives, I think, somewhere in the Bay Area, when she talked about the Gulf War, she said, war is like crack. It's a quick fix, and then, when it's over, you realize what terrible harm has been done. I think the great problem for human ingenuity in this next 100 years, now that we're, at this date in the calendar, we like to talk about the next 100 years very wisely. But I think that, the problem is how do we solve the fundamental problems of hunger and disease, and injustice, and how do we do it without killing large numbers of people? That is, how do we do it while renouncing war, as a solution? That's what human ingenuity should be used for.
Yeah, a good time.
I didn't want her to miss my talk. Okay, I'm starting over. I'm going to do the whole thing over again. Oh, yeah, great to see you. Thank you.
Enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Spend the night. Whenever you're ready. Whenever Howard's ready.
I don't think she deserves a moment of rest.
Because I came to hear you.
Oh, yeah, you came to hear me.
How are you doing? I'm so glad to see her. Okay,
Fine.
should I go ahead and turn you on?
Oh, well, there should be a way.
Howard Zinn is a historian, playwright, and social activist. This book, A People's History of the United States, is published by HarperCollins. A 20th anniversary edition was released last month. 48 hours of nonfiction books.